Hello and welcome to my congress. So I'd like to tell you something about children prevention in educational institutions. So as far as I'm concerned, my name is Anja Stiller and I work for the Kinderschutzbund in Niedersachsen. And so I'm also responsible for the children protection concept. In the past, I also worked in the field of children protection and and in research. Today, I'd like to tell you first something in general about the children protection concepts, and then I will explain what modules it encompasses, and finally I will dwell on the necessary steps. So let's start with the general information. First of all, I will explain to you what the general goal of children protection concepts is. So it is all about the idea of creating a safe place for children and youth on the basis of the children's right. It is also important to create and to develop an attitude shared by all, so that also staff members can receive staff members in the institutions should also receive orientation about the management of violence and abuse of power. As far as this last point is concerned, I also would like to point out that it is also important to protect oneself from suspicions, because if you work in a specific structure and if you have specific guidelines in the institutions, there may be problems related to the exposure to suspicion that needs, and for this reason you need to be properly protected. And so as far as the children protection concept is concerned, here you see a general overview of the WHO, and you see the different types of violence against children. You see, for example, we have physical violence, bullying, and this means violence among children, then mobbing, and also violence among youth and young people, but also partner violence that may happen, so teen dating violence. And then we have also other factors and forms of violence that may occur in institutions, sexualized violence and emotional or psychological violence. As far as these two last forms of violence against children, well, they span throughout the entire life of children through the adult phase, whereas the other types of violence usually occur during specific moments in life. Before we move on, let me focus on these two types of violence, that is sexualized violence and emotional and psychological violence. I will dwell on the problems and issues to be considered, and this is basically what I mean by that. As you can see here, this is a definition of sexualized violence. And in this respect, we mean any context of sexuality, power, or violence that violates or compromises the integrity of human beings. The definition of sexualized violence focuses on the issue of violence. In other words, it's not about sexuality in itself, but about a violent exercise of power that uses the medium of sexuality in the most diverse forms. And so this distinguishes this definition from other types of violence as sexual violence In this case, we focus very much on the topic of violence. Sexualized violence encompasses different types of definitions based on the type of action that occurs. We have the hands-on violence with, and the hands-off violence with or without body contact. So with a direct body contact, we have reference to penetrative acts, and we also have acts of sexual contact. By penetrative acts, we mean all acts of completed or attempted vaginal or anal penetration and all contacts between the mouth and genitals and mouth. Acts of sexual contact are all types of touching, including over the clothing in the intimate area, for example, genitals or inner thighs, or also the desire to be touched in these places. Sexualized violence without body contact. In this case, we have children or youth that may be exposed to sexual activities, for example, exhibitionism or pornography, or filming or pictures with children that portrays the child in a sexualized manner. But we also mean verbal sexual harassment and acts that facilitate child prostitution. Then moving forward to the emotional and psychological violence, we have body and physical violence and neglect. And in this case, we have a maltreatment or a neglect. They both refer to the emotional type of violence. By maltreatment, we mean the repeated behavior by caregivers that makes a child feel massively anxious, worthless, unloved, or rejected. For example, in the case of threatening, shaming, belittling, taking advantage, or isolating. As far as neglect is concerned, we mean that the emotional and cognitive needs of children remain unanswered for a specific period of time. For example, the absence of age-appropriate stimulation in the cognitive area. There's no language exchange, and there is also an inadequate or neglected supervision of children. This is what we mean by neglect. These forms of violence may lead to different types of consequences. Here again, you see an overview of the WHO that depicts the various types of consequences. As you can see, we have different types of categories. We have the psychological health, for example, and by that we mean depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. But as a second category, we have injury, and by that we mean both physical violence but also sexualized violence, and this may refer to factors such as burns or injuries. In a broader sense, we also have transmissible diseases in relation with sexualized violence, and we also have risky behaviors that may become apparent, for example, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, etc. Well, you may have realized that I'm very cautious in formulating these issues because we have different types of factors, and it also depends on the seriousness and on the degree of violence, on the frequency and the duration of the violent episodes. And based on that, well, it also depends on the resources available and other risk factors. We may have more serious consequences. for example, if there are other risk factors and no resources, or also the school context, of bullying, and the fact that violence is also experienced at home, this can enhance the degree of the consequences, or verbal violence. These are all factors that may increase the development of the consequences related to violence, to the experience of violence. What should we know about the offenders in the field of sexualized violence? Well, in this case, offenders usually come from the household context. They're usually family members or relatives. So we have family members, but also trainer, parish priests, group leaders, and teachers in the field of institutions. In institutions, we may find offenders, and in this case, key is the fact that children have a trusted relationship with the offender, and this is what is exploited in the strategy adopted by the offenders. It is very important to point out that offenders may also come from an institutional context, and I also want to point out that institutions may also represent risk. If we go deeper into the details of this issue, another very important element that becomes evident is that the size of sexualized violence and may also depend on the type of offenders. So in institutions, it can occur through staff members who work in institutions, and there is also a sort of power imbalance between children and the staff members. So in institutions, children and young people are, as we said, not at the same level as the staff members. There are some dependency structures in institutions, for example, in schools, and the trust relationship can be exploited in the strategies adopted by the offenders, as we said. Besides the staff members that may be considered as potential offenders, we also have other dimensions in the experience of violence by children and young people. As we said, so we can also have violent episodes outside institutions, a family, for example, or the past of the institution. And so we can also have assaults between and among children and young people, and between and among staff members. An employee, for example, can be violent, both emotionally and physically. Children see that, and this may have consequences for the children. Slightly different is the situation of sexualized violence, and let's have a look at the prevalence and the frequency of sexualized violence in institutions. Here you see the statistics of the criminal statistics of the police, and here you see the number of reported cases of sexual abuse. Here you see a prevalence rate of 5%. This means that in formal social relationships in institutions, organizations, and groups, 5% of the reported cases refer to sexualized violence. Well, interestingly, the gender ratio is well in balance between male and females. So both male and females are likewise exposed to violence. The situation is different in family situations where women and females are usually the most impacted ones, with a ratio of 80-20. Another thing I have already hinted at is that these are the reported cases, so the bright field, but we also know that there is a dark field with a number of unreported cases. That plays a very important role. There are many unreported cases, and here you see an analysis carried out by an independent organization on sexualized child abuse. And here you see, for example, a survey. People were interviewed about their violent experiences. This is a one-stop shop that people could call. And so they carried out a survey about 3,000 respondents. Well, this is a sample that can hardly be representative, but we have a good breakdown of the situation, so where violence can be experienced. So here you see the average age is 46, and 60% of the respondents were women. What I can point out is that most of the episodes are experienced in families, and that's the reason for calling the one-stop shop. 1 out of 3 people called because of violence in an institutional context. A lower number of people experienced violence due to offenders from outside the institutions. And then we also analyzed the type of institutions that were reported. And you see we have the church area. Most of the respondents refer to this situation. And so the Catholic Church plays a very important role. And so this could have been a greater motivation for reporting such a case. But you also see that schools and households play a very important role, and also associations. Even though the percentage is lower, they do represent an important case. And now we have also a study concerning sexual abuse in the German Catholic Church. This is a study, a paper that was published in 2019. And it is a very broad paper with different types of projects. Here you see the analysis of files, and a questionnaire was handed over, and many interviews were conducted. The prevention work was also analyzed. We also have online data. But what I'd like to show you here is what comes out of the analysis of the files up to 2014. And here you see that about 4% of the people were accused. And so we have about 3,700 people. So about 40,000 files were inspected, and slightly more than 4% of the people reported here were then accused. What is important, in my opinion, and what is really key in this analysis was the fact that if we take a look at the conclusions of the procedures and the reaction of the church based on the accusation, we see that in most of the cases, the church simply changed the field of activity of the offender. This was the most frequent reaction of the Catholic Church. In some minor cases, we have some therapy measures, therapeutic measures. Or, for example, what is really impressive is that none of the cases were punished. So what I'd like to point out here is that at least as far as sexual violence is concerned, it is not a taboo, but it's simply the fact of speaking about sexualized violence is a taboo, and people were simply removed from their activity, and they were simply transferred to another place. If we have a look at the triangle between offenders, victims and institutions, you see that there is a close interrelationship between these three elements. But if from this equation we remove one of the elements, for example, the offender, and if we replace the offender with another person, the problems in the institution remains because we still have risk there, and so the problem lies in the institution, and this may lead to the fact that these incidents may be repeated by another person. Violence can develop in a place where this is possible, and violence is exercised in the place that is available. So how can we create for children and young people safe places where they feel protected? I'd like to go into the detail of this issue by showing the different modules and components of the children protection concepts. Taking into account that these modules are based on the principles of children protection, so you can have a look at the literature, and all these principles are also based on the principles defined by the Child Protection Agency. Let me first focus on the basis of the children protection concept. You see that these are the basic needs of children and young people. So you see the different types of needs. So the need for love and stability, for physical integrity, safety and protection, individual experiences, developmentally appropriate experiences, boundaries and structures, stable communities, and a safe future. Why am I saying so? Because it is important to point out that unlike the basic principles and basic needs that are to be taken into account, for example, eating and drinking, here we see the specific needs that are essential for children and young people. And by fulfilling these basic needs, we resort to different types of rules and regulations. Well, first of all, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that is the basis of the child protection. I don't want to go into the detail of the other rules and regulations, but in Germany, we do have rules and regulations protecting the needs of children and young people. For example, so again, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that sets the foundation of the rights of the rules and regulations. But we also have, since last year, the Child and Youth Strengthening Act, which has improved the situation. But we also have the Federal Child Protection Act that focused much more on the need for children and young people to participate in the life of the society. So during time, as time went by, new rules and regulations were passed to improve the situation of children and young people. And so this leads me to talking about the different modules. We have the basic need, the basic foundation, which are the basic needs and principles to define the child protection concept in institutions. Here you see the different modules that are included in the concept on the bottom left. So you see participation is common to all the modules because you have different types of modules in the concept. They all have the same relevance and importance, but they may be linked to different contexts. You start with an organization analysis. That is, you have to consider the risks and resources in the relevant institution. Then the results are discussed and identified together with the organization. And then you move forward step by step with personal management, with staff management, knowledge transfer and qualifications. So knowledge that needs to be transferred, and then you move forward concerning complaint management. For example, you look into the institution and see how complaint management can be improved, or an operational plan should be introduced in institutions, and also a code of conduct and sexual education concept should be in place. For the different modules, different groups can be set up. There is usually a coordination group which is responsible for the general planning, but it depends on the type of institutions and on the size and resources available in the institutions, but you have the chance of establishing a coordination group and other subgroups. Participation is key. And in children protection concepts, you have to consider the areas of prevention and intervention. What can I do in terms of prevention, and what can we do if a situation occurs, a situation of violence occurs? And then we have all the different departments of an institutions that are involved in the concept at all levels. And this is really important because, as I said in the beginning, with the goal, it is very important that you develop an attitude shared by all, and that all the people working in the institution support the same attitude. Likewise, it is important to recognize that female and male young people can experience sexualized violence in all situations. This has to be clear, and so you have to consider the relationships of power and dependency that may exist, and in particular also the issue of colleagues with whom you can have a trusted relationship. This is very important because we as adults are responsible for the protection of children and young people, and so we have to consider that we are responsible for the safety and protection of children and young people as adults. For this reason, the process for the development of a concept has to be supported and initiated by the authority, by the institution itself. In a nutshell, children the prevention of violence in institutions against children and young people can only succeed if boundary preserving behavior does not depend only on the individual attitudes and on the skills of individual staff members, but if a series of preventive measures are anchored institutionally. And this can happen only if all the employees follow the same attitude. In conclusion, let me focus on the necessary steps, and I will go into the details of it in the last 4 minutes. In summary, we can say that we have different types of steps that are relevant in order to develop and implement a children safety concept in an institution. What is it all about? Well, first of all, as we said, it is very important that the institution, the managers, and the people responsible in the institution take up their responsibility for the concept. First of all, the theme has to be defined, and afterwards, it is important to discuss the necessity of setting up a coordination group in the institution, a coordination group that develops a plan and how to implement the entire concept. In this process, it may also be relevant to resort to external consultancy, and external consultants who may define the tasks, the objectives, the projects, or the involvement of the coordination group. And then we have participatory working groups that can be set up within the framework of the modules or within the framework of the concept in general. This can apply to different types of sectors, and according to the size of the institution, you can also set up sub-working groups which always report to the entire team. Within the framework of the entire process, it is important to consider what you see here in gray. That is that you may need to resort to an external support, and these may be consultants or people who may support with the relevant skills this process. And but the management of the institution is always on board. The fourth step is the raising awareness in the institution at all levels. All the employees have to be informed about the children protection concept. After the internal sensitization and awareness raising campaign, we have a kickoff event where all the different departments are invited so that skills and knowledge are transferred, and the roadmap is defined for the development of this concept. So the tasks are to be defined in the near future, and so as to raise awareness among the employees of the institutions. Once the kickoff event has occurred, we can move to the implementation phase, and with the individual modules, with the consultancy from outside, or also without counseling from outside, if skills and resources are available in that institution. And then finally, you can deal with the different modules and how to implement them. This is it as far as I'm concerned. If you have any questions and if you have further interest in the topic, you can contact the Kinderschutzzentrum in Hanover, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. If not, thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again.